Hello, everyone. My name is Prathamesh, and I serve as the India Admissions Advisor at Ohio University. Welcome to this session called Pencils Down Equitable Testing in the Evaluation Process. I'll be sharing a few housekeeping rules in the interest of health and safety. Please make sure that masks fully covering both the nose and mouth are always kept on at all times during the session, including when asking questions. Microphones will not be shared or passed. Please ask your questions from the stationary microphone stand. Keep your masks on when asking a question. The microphones have been sanitized between sessions. The last 15 minutes of the session will be dedicated to Q&A. In-person audiences, please raise your hand and wait for the moderator to invite you to the microphone stand. Virtual audiences, please use a virtual hand raise and wait for the virtual panelist or an IC3 volunteer to invite you. All right. So with that, I'm going to take the opportunity to also introduce my colleagues who are with me on this panel, starting with Mr. Kevin Hostetler, who's a Strategic Engagement Manager, Duolingo English Test, US. Then we have Dr. Niki McInteer, Associate Dean of Admissions, International Undergraduate Admissions at Wake Forest University, North Carolina. And we have Ms. Jennifer Matthews, who's the Director, International Admissions, Office of Admissions, Syracuse University. I'm going to hand things off to Kevin. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for that great introduction, and also thank you to the panel for joining on this very important topic as we discuss test optional and how to equitably introduce this into our admission process, especially in the United States, where tests have begun to be a topic of conversation for many years. This pandemic has really brought us to a place where we have to have the discussion. And so we want to just have this panel to really dive deep into that and then answer your questions. We're lucky we have some great panelists with us today, and we'll just go ahead and get started. And so we're going to start first with talking about understanding test optional. And what I want to do is have Jen answer this question. Does test optional really mean test optional?
Thanks, Kevin, and hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us both in person and virtually. In whatever time zone you're in, we're happy to have you. So when we say test optional, the answer is always complicated when it comes to admissions, but the short answer is yes. And one of the things I wanted to do in relation to this conversation was post this link that I'm putting in the chat right now. And this was from NACAC. So there were a number of institutions, including both Wake Forest and Syracuse, that signed a pledge that says test optional means test optional, and that students will not be penalized for not submitting a test score. So ultimately, that's what that means. It means that if a student chooses not to submit a standardized test score, and this is referring primarily to the SAT or the ACT. English testing is kind of a different bucket, and I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But essentially what that means is that we're not penalizing a student, and we're going to be taking all of the other factors in the application into consideration. It is always a good idea in anything we talk about related to college admissions in the United States specifically, to reach out to an admissions office and talk to them about what test optional means in the context of their institution. But the short answer is yes, test optional means test optional, and we will not penalize a student for not submitting a test score.
Thank you so much, Jen. My next question is for Prathamesh. How comfortable are students and families in India with holistic review, with less emphasis on test scores in the admission process?
Thanks, Kevin, for that question. So firstly, in India, what I have experienced is there is not enough understanding of the term holistic review. Students and parents generally are curious about what it means. During my interactions, when I say that at my institution, we have a holistic review process, they look at me and they're like, what does that even mean? and I have to explain to them that uh, as part of the holistic review, we are going to consider, you know, um, the other factors aside from the academics. It's not just going to be your academics and SAT, ACT test scores, but it's also going to be your extracurriculars, letters of recommendation, essays, the strength and rigor of the curriculum, the class rank, all of those. So yeah, not enough understanding about the term, as I said, and also they are happy when I tell them about this, because that just takes the pressure off from them about they not having to give another test, because they're already in their last year of high school, and again, it can be quite daunting. So yeah, they're happy to kind of listen in about holistic review. Yes.
Great. And that actually is a perfect segue to my next question, which is for Niki. How do you personally explain test optional to international students and parents? I think that's one of the hardest things, is to be able to put on that counseling hat and explain this concept. So how do you do that, Niki?
It is a bit different for an international audience, I'll have to say. And I think the thing I try to explain is that it's the misconception around test optional is that there's people who submit tests and people who don't, and you should frame your application around those two paradigms. But I think when a university says they're test optional, what they're really saying is that no matter if you submit or if you don't, the test is not the most important thing about the application. And so when I explain test optional, I say, even if you do submit your score, it will rarely make or break your application. It just adds a piece that some students don't have. And so every application is different. Every application has different transcripts, different recommendation letters, different things we receive from a school. But the test score just becomes another piece of that application. And so it really becomes up to the student whether or not they want to include that piece in their application. So I think that we shouldn't see it as a students who submit and students who don't, and see them as two different categories. What we're saying is that the test is not the most important piece of that application, and every institution will define what's important in their reading process, but test optional is de-emphasizing that test score, and it doesn't have as much of an impact as students imagine it to.
Awesome. We wanted to first ask these questions that are around understanding tests optional, but we do want really to jump into the meat of this presentation, which is alternatives to testing and access. So my next question is for Jen. What components in the application indicate a student's ability to succeed at a U.S. university if we don't take test scores into consideration? What are the alternatives so that we can make sure our students are succeeding whenever they come to our campuses?
Absolutely. I think to Niki's point, the test score has actually never really been the most important factor at any institution in the States. And again, there are different practices when you're talking about schools outside of the United States. But when we talk about holistic admission review, the most important question any admissions committee asks themselves is this student going to be successful at our institution, right? That's the most important question. And in truth, for us, the academic records, the transcripts, are always going to be a more important factor than a test score. 4 years or 3 years of academic history in relation to a 4-hour exam on a Saturday morning, where the student may be stressed and not performing to their best anyway. So for us, that academic history, the rigor of the curriculum that they've chosen in relation to what their school offers, those things are far more important to us than, frankly, like an exam score that came from a 4-hour exam. There are other things too that come into play here, and this is where holistic admissions, where this comes out. And that is things like recommendation letters or activities. They tell us a lot about a student's work ethic, about their aptitude for academic subjects, about their engagement, about their leadership potential. And those are all important factors when it comes to assessing a student's college readiness. So all of those things come into play. But when it comes to brass tacks, at the end of the day, the transcript has a lot more weight than a test score would, even in a normal year.
Awesome. Prathamesh, my next question is for you. What shifts have you seen in admissions or your institution since adopting a test optional policy?
Okay, so this is interesting you ask. Ohio University went test optional forever since fall 2020. And what we've seen is we've become this approachable university now, more than ever before. And that has led to more inquiries. Earlier, the test was seen as a barrier. That's what I feel in my experience. But now the conversations are free flowing. Students are at least approaching us and considering Ohio University. And also, we've seen an uptick in the application numbers for this year after going test optional.
Awesome. It's great to hear. It seems like for you and for many institutions, this is a policy that is helping students to maybe explore more universities and to maybe be more curious about universities that they might not have thought before or would have applied to because of testing. Niki, my question is for you. Is there a difference in how admission offices use exams such as the SAT or ACT and English proficiency exams? This is important for international students specifically. And maybe if you could also answer specifically for our students who are in India who might still have to take these types of tests.
Yes, absolutely. So Wake Forest, we think the SAT and ACT measure how well you take those exams, right? Like there is this kind of misconception that ACT and SAT measure intelligence, which we do not think does. As Jen was saying, the transcript really tells us so much more about how you've challenged yourself in high school and rigor and is the biggest indicator of how well you'll do on our campus, not the ACT or SAT. So for us, again, that test score is just kind of the smallest piece of the application and students are allowed to choose it. Whereas an English proficiency exam is really measuring something that is necessary to have a baseline to have a successful experience in our classrooms at Wake Forest. So English proficiency exams really share something about a student's ability to succeed on our campus, whereas SAT and ACT just measure how well that student has done on that exam and how well that student has prepared for that exam. So we don't view that as an aptitude, whereas Duolingo or TOEFL does show an aptitude that students need to have for the classroom. So if that makes sense. So one we see as kind of a very practical implication for the classroom, and one we see as just an add-on that tells us something about the student, but isn't as kind of a baseline marker of intelligence or success.
Awesome. I'm going to stick with you, Niki, for this next question. This is about access. We've heard a lot of discussion about how test optional policies influence access to college campuses, to college education, how we use them appropriately now, these test optional policies. So I want to ask, what are some best practices to equitably reviewing applications from candidates who have not submitted test scores in relation to those that have? And I apologize, I'm outside and there's a nice bug, as you can hear in the summer here in New England. So Niki, I'm turning it over to you for that question.
I hear that bug. Yeah, get your bug spray out. So I think there is a misconception that we read every application the same. So I approach every application with a new lens. And you have to, because every student is different. And that's part of our job, to get to know what it means to come from CBSE or ISC or German Abitur or any other curriculum from around the world. And so you can't just approach every application with the same attitude. But as Jen said, the guiding question through every application is, will the student succeed? And we look for markers of that in the application. And so that looks different for every student. And every application has different pieces. Some students include an art portfolio. Some students include extra recommendations. Some students include a TOEFL score, IELTS score, and Duolingo score. And so it's, every application looks a little different, and you just have to really focus on what are the markers that I see here that would make the student successful at Wake Forest or any other institution that we're coming from. And so I think, just when we read applications, we have a fresh lens and we don't look at students, the same way. And so the word equitable is kind of funny here, because we do approach it very differently and look for different pieces. But it's like an extra recommendation letter. It's an extra piece. And so that test score just tells us one thing about that student, but it doesn't say everything. And so And we look at the application as a big puzzle and how that puzzle puts together an impression of a student. And I think test optional admissions is saying that that puzzle piece that includes the test score has gotten a lot smaller, right? And how we fill out that student. And so it's not a penalty if a student doesn't have that. We don't assume things like, oh, they must not have done well, or we don't make that assumption. I hardly notice it, to be honest. What impresses me is a great essay or a stellar transcript, or a student who has taken a really rigorous coursework or has reflected really well on their experiences. And so to me, that speaks so much more than a test score about a student's ability to succeed at Wake Forest. And so I feel like I could ramble on about this question, but it's really just comes down to, we look at applications differently because we have to.
I love that, the metaphor of the puzzle piece and how it's getting smaller. It's a great way to visualize it and to understand it. Jen, I want to ask you that same question. If you have some best practices when it comes to equitably reviewing applications in the test optional world.
Sure. So I've got sort of two thoughts to share. The first is that our institution, actually what we did was we started asking our applicants to tell us whether or not they want us to include their test score. So what would happen is if the student said no, and so even if they sent one to us, we actually would not load it in their application file. So the person reviewing it would have no sort of unconscious bias by looking at a test score that the student didn't want us to consider. So when it comes to sort of shifting practices about review process in relation to these new test optional policies, that was one of the things that our institution did to make sure that admissions officers weren't bringing any kind of preconceived notions about a student in relation to a test score. But the other thing I wanted to say, and sort of in relation to what Niki was saying, is that I think there's also a misconception about how we review applications within context of each other, right? So I would never compare a student who went to an AP school, like an advanced placement school that offers 40 AP class options and has an unlimited opportunity for student to add as many of those to their schedule as they want, to a student who goes to a school that either has no AP options or maybe 3 or 4 AP options, and they're limited in the number they can take every year. That's like comparing apples and oranges, right? So when we look at students and rigor in their course selections and things of that nature, we're very much looking at it within the context of what the school has available to the student and how much they've challenged themselves within that context. Right. So that's part of holistic admission as well, is understanding the context in which the student is applying from. And so it's important to remember that that was also true well before this all happened, but that additional context, we know, and I think this is also sort of jumping ahead a little bit, but we know that test access is also inequitable across locations, financially. There's a lot of other factors that come into play. And so again, it's not as simple as this test score equals this and this student's admissible. There's so many other factors that come in.
Awesome. And Jen, we're going to stick with you. What are some of the biggest barriers that you see to test access when working with prospective students, especially international students?
Yeah. So I was sort of just touching on this, and this is where I sort of see 3 distinct categories of issues that I see working with students. I've worked with students in every major region of the world. And the truth is that there's sort of 3 barriers. One's finances. One is the location of the test center. And the other would be sort of cultural barriers, right? Context in which the student is applying from. And I will never forget, as long as I live, I went to an international ACAC conference several years ago and heard an Education USA advisor from Africa talk about giving the SAT. She was a proctor for the exam at a test center. And there was only one test center in the entire country. And students were taking a 10-hour overnight bus from their remote village in another part of the country. They were sleeping outside on the ground outside of the test center and got in the next day, and they start taking this exam, and they got to a section on essay questions. And the essay question was, what was the impact of reality television on modern pop culture? And she said she saw an entire room full of African students go, like, they just didn't really have the context to understand that question. And that story has stayed with me for years, because to me, it sort of indicates all of those barriers in one go. You know, you could be in a country where the currency in relation to the US dollar is significantly devalued. And so that cost of that exam is is humongous, right, in relation to what maybe their annual income is as a family. So finances are definitely a factor. Location, again, you've got some countries where there's maybe one or two test centers in the entire country, or there's multiple test centers at international schools, but they're closed to centers only available to the students at that school. And so other local students would have to go elsewhere to take it. And then again, cultural barriers. There are questions in there. We know they like to say that it's, you know, that they've removed some of these, but I'm still skeptical. There are a lot of questions in there that are either very American centric or very Western culture centric. And so it's sort of difficult for the student to overcome that cultural understanding hurdle. So all of those things come into play when I think about the barriers that international students have. Additionally, the opportunities to ask for a fee waiver and receive one for the testing fees is a very cumbersome process. And students don't always have the documentation they need, or a counselor who is well connected to the college board to help them with that process. So it's just a very, there are definitely some barriers I see, and that would be sort of a selection of things that I've seen in my day.
Awesome. That's a very, I can see how that story stuck with you from the EdUSA counselor. It's like you said, all of those things combined into one when you're thinking about access. Prathamesh, I have a question for you. Even if COVID were no longer a risk or concern, there are real costs of testing for international students. Beyond the cost of the test, what else do you wish US colleges and university admission offices understood about barriers to access for SAT or ACT testing outside the United States?
Right. So I think being clear about what test optional really means, because there's a lot of confusion, questions among the students here, especially after we've gone test optional. I have a lot of counselors who've approached me saying, what do you mean by test optional? Because there's test blind, there is test flexible also. So what is the difference, So that understanding has still not come, I feel. I mean, it's coming through such sessions and through colleges, through advisors like us. So I feel being clear about what it means, because every college again also has a different policy when it comes to test optional. Some may be optional for admissions, but they may not be optional for scholarships. So there's a caveat there. So you need to really find out whether they are really test optional. Are they going to still consider me for scholarships and admission both? There are also colleges who would, consider your SAT, ACT score for the placement test. Like once you enroll into a US college, they put you in a placement group, math placement level, or there are some other groups. So your SAT or ACT scores also determines your level in that particular group. So you really need to be clear about all those things, and I think colleges can start mentioning about it explicitly on the websites, on the marketing materials, and the other touch points, for students. And also, in a way, assuring the, students who are applying to the institution that, hey, you're still going to be, considered for scholarships and admission. It's not like you're going to lose out because you have not submitted the SAT or ACT score. Yeah.
I'm going to stick with you for one question, a little bit of a curveball question for you, Prathamesh. Is test optional helping international students? Do you believe that this process is helping international students, and specifically in India?
Yes. As I said, we've suddenly become this approachable college, and we've seen a lot of inquiries. And again, before we were test optional, we did not have these kind of inquiries coming in. People were either skeptical, or once they came and talked to me, and when they found out that, oh, you're going to be you're not going to be considering my test score for admissions, but you're going to be considering it for scholarships, because earlier it was the policy at my institution. But after that, when I tell them that, hey, you are not going to be, treated differently, and you're still going to be considered for all the scholarship awards that we offer, they're suddenly happy, and then they start like applying to the university, and also tell the other friends, that may be considering applying to other US institutions.
Awesome. So I wanted to start talking a little bit about the future of test optional as we head into the last few minutes before we open it up to questions. Jen, I want to ask you, if you could see the future of admissions testing in a crystal ball and predict the future, what would it look like?
Sure. So in my crystal ball, what I would see is a lot what Niki had sort of alluded to earlier, which is the idea of a test score being a supplemental material in the application. Some students will interview, or they will submit an extra essay, or whatever they do in relation to trying to strengthen their application. I think that in a lot of ways, those pieces are not essential for us to make a decision about a student's admissibility, but it gives us a little extra insight into them. And I think in the future, my hope is that the test score will be sort of relegated to that realm of additional information that's bonus, if you will, to the admissions committee, rather than a main piece of the admissions consideration for a student. I think what we were saying about, there are institutions that are test optional, but that may require it for a scholarship consideration. I suspect that as more institutions go test optional and this becomes a more normal policy, that those things will also change and become more widely accessible to a wider range of students as well. And I think that as that happens, and I also think that at least from my institution's point of view, and I'm sure others as well, it sounds like Ohio State's also getting more inquiries. We had an increase in applications because we went test optional last year. And I think the senior leadership of our institution was delighted by that. So I think that will also be motivation for senior leadership to consider keeping these policies permanently.
Awesome. Niki, do you think testing will return as a mandatory part of the college admissions process? Do you think there will be a movement back to testing in this process for US institutions?
I'll answer this in two ways. First, from my little corner of the world, and then I'll try and answer it in a larger way. But at Wake Forest, we've been test optional since 2008. So we have done this test optional thing for a long time. We did not shift because of the pandemic. We have had this commitment for a long time. And it prompted because a sociology professor at Wake Forest did a lot of predictions on, or did a lot of research on what predicts success in college. And he found that the test is not what predicts success. It's high school rigor and GPA. And so we made that informed decision, and we have been really happy with the results at Wake Forest. And I think more institutions will see that, not just the increase in applications, but the amount of first-generation students and underrepresented minorities and underserved students who are now have a little bit extra step forward, or a little bit of a not as much of a disadvantage. And so I think I do at Wake Forest, we have never ever said, did we make a mistake? We really have been happy with that decision and how it's shaped our applicant pool and our thinking about this process. It is not going to change anytime soon at Wake Forest. And if we zoom out a little bit and look at other institutions, I did read on Fair Test that the ACT did a report, and it showed that the foreseeable future, testing is not going to become a mandatory part. So it's hard for me to answer that question without kind of thinking of my own institutional experience at Wake Forest, but I think that universities will see a difference and for the positive. So that's, I can't see it coming back in the foreseeable future, but who knows? Yeah.
Who knows? Exactly. Maybe one day, or maybe a different type of test or something, a new way to be able to look at students. Who knows what else we'll end up discovering? It actually predicts success. A question for you: what is a basic step that college admission offices could take at this very moment to improve the test optional application process for international students? I know you've talked a little bit about being better at informing students and explaining. What's that basic step that you would tell our colleagues who are watching today what they should go out and do today to make this a better opportunity for.
I think an assurance from the advisors. Again, this is a repeat of what I said, but that's the most important thing, because this is again coming from my interactions with the students and parents on ground. When I tell them test optional, some of who understand this, they again cross question asking, oh, so am I not going to be eligible for all your other hidden scholarships that you may give to, say, a test submitter? Or will I not get those extra brownie points, or what is it? So I think that assurance from advisors like us that, hey, you're going to be all right. If you don't want to submit your test score, that's completely okay. And we are going to review your application just like any other student, So yeah, that would be my advice to the folks who are tuning in today.
And Prathamesh, I think it's such an important point that you talk about scholarships. There's been a lot of discussion now about decoupling scholarships from test scores, because a lot of universities have some sort of test score requirement or use them in the process to determine scholarships. So I'm so glad that you mentioned that, and that being a big step to making this a more equitable process, that scholarships are not coupled to these test scores. So thank you so much. That is the end of our questions with our panelists from me. But we're all most excited that we are getting to hear from all of you, whether live in India or around the world. So I'm going to turn it over to anyone who would like to ask this great panel a question.
Divya, can we pass the microphone to Nagma? Nagma has a question. No, they are just handing it over to you, I think. Sorry. Okay. Sorry, I didn't see that. Please bear with us.
Yeah. I can hear myself. Great. Thank you so much for the session. It was very interesting. I'm a high school counselor from India, and we have students who are confused. We are confused, and we are learning. Honestly, we have people like Pramathesh who help us. So we are learning. Now my question is that because our students are we're so dependent on test scores, because we were looking at it as a parameter, right? And that is one thing which now we feel that we have lost it. So Jennifer did touch about on profile building and what other things you look at when you talk about holistic acceptance. And that is something which, yes, we understand, but I will talk about myself. The clarity still needs to, there need to be further clarity. And that is my question, that if the test scores are not there, and the scholarship part, because that is one thing which we feel in India as a high school counselor, it's not very transparent. So though the colleges claim that they are test optional, but when it comes to scholarship, that's one thing which we struggle with. And my question is that the parameters, if we can have more, some kind of clarity on that too, and that's it. So thank you.
It's a fantastic question. I'm going to jump in and just talk a little bit, and of course the other panelists make sure to answer. I think in general there's a movement in the United States especially to make the entire admission process more transparent from beginning to end. There has been a long tradition of kind of gatekeeping in US universities, and it's just something that, as we discuss how society works, makes us need to be more of a transparent process. And I think that test optional does a great job of allowing us to be more transparent or pushing us to be more transparent because it requires more of a discussion about what it actually is that gets a student that scholarship or gets them into one of our universities. And so that to me is one of the groundworks of this whole thing, is an increase in transparency in the admission process in general. And I'm going to turn it over to
I'll jump in a little bit. I think Kevin is so right that transparency is a big trend, but also we've noticed at Wake Forest that more is not always better in the admissions process. And so I think students sometimes feel like they have to pile on things to their application to be competitive, when what we're asking for is more than enough to get a sense of who that student is, their voice, and their ability to succeed on our campus. And so for example, when we instituted a test optional policy, we thought we have to get to know the student in another way because we're taking apart or we're taking away a piece of that puzzle. So we actually asked our students to interview with us. We are shying away from that a little bit because we find that that's a barrier sometimes with students not being able to interview. And we found that even if we take away that puzzle piece, we still have admitted wonderful students who do spectacular things and go on to win Rhodes scholarships. And so, I think that there's a misconception that more is always better or more makes a competitive applicant, when it's really the thoughtfulness that they approach to the application process that impresses us and helps a student stand out, and the intentionality behind that application process, not just applying to 40 universities or 20 universities, but really being intentional in that process. But so I think transparency and also reducing barriers is a big discussion right now. And testing is one of those barriers. And that also goes into our scholarship process as well.
Yeah, I think the one thing I would throw in there in addition to that, something I touched on earlier, which is context. There's sort of, the first thing that I'll say, and I mentioned this at the very beginning, is that if you have questions about this, people like me and Niki, and all of our other university reps in the room, we are there to answer those questions. And the one sort of complicated piece, well, there's many complicated pieces in US college admissions, but the extra complicated piece is that all of us do this a little bit differently and have different priorities in this process. So if you want to know, that's when you reach out to an admissions counselor at that institution and you ask the question, what does this look like for your institution? So that's the first thing. The other thing I want to mention again is context. Those of us who have been recruiting in a place like India for many, many years, which we all have, we understand that a student who goes to maybe an ISC school or a CBSE school isn't going to have the same necessarily school provided level of activities or clubs that, maybe an international IB school would offer. And we understand that, we've been there, we've seen the students on the ground, we know that there are some limitations to what their involvement can look like. And so an admissions committee that's well informed about a student applying from India or another country or a national system in any place, this is context we understand, and we look at that student within that context, not within the context of comparing them to a student at an IB school or a US AP school or whatever it is. So, I think part of it is to have some faith in us to understand that every student's context is different. And that's what holistic admissions review is really all about, is understanding not only context, and yes, we talk about leadership and, in community engagement and community service and volunteerism and all this stuff, which is true. But we also understand in the context of a school, not every student has access to that. So, it's also, again, asking those questions of people like us to help guide your students.
Great. I think we have one question, or there's something in the chat box. Can we just access that, please? Okay.
I think in the chat box is a link that Jen sent out,
right,
with some NACAC newsroom.
Yes, that was the test optional means test optional pledge that many of our institutions' leadership signed in relation to this conversation.
Any other questions from the in-person? Are you seeing there?
No questions.
Well, I have a question for Prathamesh. This is an interesting question that we had discussed, and perhaps we wanted, if we had extra time, to talk about with holistic review as it pertains to certain curricula. We've talked about CBSC and ISC and all these curricula that we work with on a regular basis, IB, AP. Do you think that from your perspective, that holistic review benefits some curricula instead of others?
That's a great question. My answer is going to be yes and no. Yes, accessible. I mean, yes, because it's accessible than you know earlier times. The universities who have become test optional, and the students of certain curricula like IB or Cambridge, since they anyway have certain things built into their curriculum, they have the advantage of showcasing it to the institutions that they're applying to, and that just, as I said, enhances their profile. And no, because we have like so many different education boards, right, in India, and with varying marking schemes. It becomes difficult for the admissions offices also to kind of go for an impartial review sometimes. And also I feel that those students who are not from, say, an international curriculum, they do not have access to maybe certain activities or events that they may do at a school, or as part of the student club or anything like that. So that sometimes kind of puts them at a disadvantage when they are applying as a test optional candidate to the university, because they have nothing to show apart from academics. So somewhere they may lose out on those points. So yeah, this is what I feel about it benefiting students of a certain curricula. Yes.
And I'll just add that I think that for me, it's the admission officer who needs to understand that curriculum. And it's not necessarily the student's responsibility, because we need to understand the school context. And so I hope that admission officers around the United States, around the world, get to know the curricula in which they're working, because that allows you to find wonderful students who will be great fits on your campus, even if they don't show the same types of activities or the same type of writing or the same type of any sort of application qualification that someone at an IB or international or Western curriculum necessarily would. So that to me is a very important point, that admission officers do that work.
Kevin, I'll just add that because we have a lot of guidance counselors in the room, that letter of recommendation is so important. And sometimes I think it's also helpful to zoom out and tell us a little bit about the school or the curriculum or what that means, because there might be admissions officers who aren't as familiar and who don't get the chance to travel or meet or participate in professional fora like IC3. And so that letter of recommendation is one of the most powerful tools in that application in order for us to understand the context.
Yeah, I would jump in and say, though, that, there are people, I know I've attended IC3 in person and I've met, principals or things like that. You may be at a school that doesn't have a college counselor. And again, this is context. This is information that an admissions officer should understand about working with students from certain national curricula, that their schools may not be set up to have, a career advisor or a college counselor. And again, that's on us to understand that. And we do, we certainly, all of us, again, we've all been working with Indian students for many years, and we know that some students are coming from schools where that is just not part of the school culture or the administration. And I do think that when a recommendation letter is submitted, that it is helpful to give that context if at all possible, whether it's a teacher or a principal or some other school administrator helping the student with the application, to just make a comment, we don't have a careers counselor at our school. Okay, great. That gives us extra information to use in the back of our minds when we're reviewing the student's application. So again, it's sort of on us and not on the student or you to really provide something that your school is not set up to provide.
Great answers, everybody. Any other questions in the room? I think I see a hand from Pooja.
Hi, I have a question. Thank you. So this is regarding a lot of university admission counselors talking about the context in which you place a student, especially the societal context and the familial context. Now, coming from an elite school, I would say, which caters to high or the upper middle class students. So our students are well supported by their families in terms of the attitude, the perspective in which they want to pursue their career, and also about the resources. Now, what more is, if you can just give the inputs there, that what more can our students do when it comes to profile? So they do engage themselves with, say, research papers, writing research papers, they do engage with social initiatives. But when it comes to, say, a cohort of 250 or 500 students within our school itself, it's a whole team of 8 counselors, career counselors that we are handling, and we are working very closely with our students. Now, my question is, how do we support, or what more can we do to support our students there? Is there anything that we can do? I know a little, yeah, but then we would still like to know. Thank you.
I mean, we so respect your work and think that counselors can only do so much, and that it's really, you're a guiding force, but you're right. It's so difficult to do more, and I don't think we're asking that of you. And I think, for me, I always say it's not what students do, it's how they reflect on it and what they've learned and how they've grown from it. And our applications provide opportunities for that kind of reflection. And so for me, it's not what students do. Students can have so many different experiences, but it's how they present themselves in the application. And as long as they're approaching that from an authentic, genuine place, I think there's not much more to do other than push them in that direction. But I really hesitate to say that there's more that counselors should do, because work that's such good work that's already been done, and it's not a matter of that. It's a matter of reflection and understanding that what you do is not as important as how you reflect on it.
Yeah, and I would also add, actually, this is a common situation in our domestic US high schools, where if a student goes to a public high school that's got 5,000 students and a counselor may have a 500 student caseload, they're not going to get to know every single one of those kids very well. And this is something we see a lot on the domestic side. So this is not just an international student question. I think that, I do believe that students have to be somewhat proactive in this process. They need to be willing to approach you and say, I need help with this. And I know that part of that is sort of fostering an environment where they feel comfortable to do that, right? And so there's that piece. But in a lot of ways, if a student's not coming to you and asking you for help, then there isn't a lot you can do. You can't force them to do that, right? So I do think that fostering an environment where they know that they can come talk to you about this is a big step in the right direction. And, and again, helping them really reflect, as Niki said, on this process. I think a lot of students don't realize that perhaps they have a family responsibility, or they're working part-time for their parents' company, or, doing an internship, or they maybe have a younger sibling that they take care of while their parents working. Those are things that do add dimension to their application. It's how they're spending their time out of school. It's developing a sense of responsibility and maturity in a student. And so to shift away from this idea that everything they have to tell the admissions committee has to be like a club or a volunteer experience organized through the school, but to think a little bit more thoroughly about how they spend their time and what skills and traits they're developing in relation to those things can be helpful.
Thank you. I have one more question, but I'll wait for others to take the question first. Then I'll come back. If nobody else is there, then I would like to.
Is there a question from Thabet? Do you have your hand raised there?
Yes. So
okay.
Urvashi is asking, as counselors to approximately 150 students in one school, how can we help differentiate themselves from each other? How are applications from the same school assessed?
I think it's a really important question, especially in the test optional context, because when you have without tests, there's not that piece of the puzzle that was there before, or it's getting smaller, as Niki called it, which I loved. I think one of the most important things to talk about with students is that whenever they're selecting schools to apply to, that when you have 150 students in the class, not every student is going to get into every one of the schools they apply to. So when you talk about it in that way, they will immediately enter this application process with a little bit more of an open mind. They should present themselves as they are, right? So a student is a student. They have their activities, their interests, their grades, their academic interests, and they should submit the applications to the universities they're most interested in. And then it's really the university admission office to decide which of those students will be the best fit on our campuses. And then students will have the ability to choose from a handful of schools what's the best fit for them. And so you have this kind of symbiotic relationship between the student's application and the university's needs or interests. And so personally, for this question, what I always have believed is that a student should simply, really just present themselves, and that is enough to differentiate from the other students, because they're separate individuals and they have different interests and passions.
Evan, thank you for saying that. I hate it when students say, "How am I unique?" And I need to focus on that. That's not helpful, because I think it just puts stress on this process. And I think instead, if they focus on who they are and what makes them interesting, or what drives their interest in learning, I think that's so much more interesting, when instead of putting this pressure on to differentiate and find a unique characteristic. So thank you so much for saying that. I agree 100%.
In the interest of time, I think we'll have to wrap today's session. I thank you for joining us in person, and whoever joined us virtually. If you have more questions, you can always get in touch with us later. And if you can please submit your feedback for the session, that would be really helpful. So you can use the conference mobile app to submit your feedback. And we wish you a great evening, morning. Thank you.